Are you struggling for money? Worried about saving for retirement? Of course you are. Over 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and the cost of living has increased by 50% in the last decade. There are more homebuyers over the age of 70 than there are under the age of 35. Investors accounted for 1/3 of all home purchases in Q2 of 2025, and the silver lining is that unemployment is on the rise. You may be wondering what to do to overcome this challenging economy, and the answer is that investment will be your real way to retirement. In this video, I will introduce you to what fundamental pitfalls of investing to avoid and how to best prepare for investment. Of course, the average American knows very little about investment, which most likely contributes to the fact that the top 10% of Americans own over 90% of stocks. Because of the lack of information on investment, it's important to have a fundamental understanding before you go throwing money at things you don't understand. The most fundamental thing to understand when preparing for investment is what behavioral biases are at play. Classical finance approaches don't account for behavioral biases or irrationality. However, as time passes, commonly accepted thought in this area has gradually included more ideas from behavioral finance and accepted that investors aren't perfectly rational beings. Examples of common behavioral biases that are often studied include loss aversion, or how people avoid risk, overconfidence bias, where people overestimate the extent of their knowledge or performance, disposition effect, when people sell winning investments or hold losing investments for too long, and a number of other biases. The focus of this video will be on the role that financial stress plays in average people's investment decisions. However, there is a distinct interplay between behavioral biases, which makes it necessary to include other relevant biases and how they affect each other. Some biases can be grouped together because of how closely related they are, such as loss aversion and risk perception. However, even in straightforward situations like this, where heightened risk perception generally increases loss aversion, the effect is still not clear-cut since it can depend on other factors within the individual. For example, experienced investors are often more likely to invest when they have increased risk perception because they see potential for higher returns, while less experienced investors are likely to experience heightened loss aversion when risk perception is elevated. Situations like this highlight the challenges of understanding behavior, but they also underscore the importance of critically evaluating one's own behavior and identifying the biases that may impair investment ability. It becomes even more difficult when you try to make up for these biases because when trying to overcome the previous situation, you face the risk of overcorrecting and falling for another bias. An extension of the previous example for the less experienced investor would be that they acknowledge their heightened risk aversion, so they try to ignore it and invest even when they don't want to. But this can lead to a form of overconfidence bias where they assume they will perform better if they are less frugal, but it can actually just lead to reckless investment. Another important cross-bias to consider is the one between loss aversion and the disposition effect. Particularly among inexperienced or highly risk-averse people, we see a strong disposition effect where people minimize gains through selling investments too soon after becoming profitable and maximize losses by waiting for something to become profitable when in reality it is only depreciating in value. This coupling of biases showcases how loss aversion can not only stop you from investing at all, but also how it can sabotage the investments you do choose. So constant monitoring and evaluation of your propensity for risk is necessary. Now that you have a better understanding of behavioral biases and their complex effect on investment decision-making, you can appreciate the role of financial stress and how relevant it is to the average American. On a large scale, widespread financial stress has been found to decrease consumer confidence in spending, along with investment, both from individuals and businesses. However, as said before, the behavior of individuals is difficult to understand or generalize, so it's important to look at the reasons why we generally see decreased investment from high financial stress, and why that may not be the case in some individuals. What we see when observing individual investment behavior is that the level of financial literacy plays a significant role in how financial stress affects loss aversion through heightened risk perception. This is very similar to the first example where the experienced investor and inexperienced investor react oppositely to raised risk perception. So, on average, higher financial stress means higher loss aversion, leading to decreased investment and investment performance. We also see that higher financial stress makes investors focus on safer short-term investments that are very reactive to economic shocks. which causes lower long-term returns and higher fluctuations in economic performance. This can be overcome by better financial literacy and planning, with evidence that widespread education in financial literacy and better financial institution raises investment performance even in high financial stress. What we can include from all the information given is that the vast majority of Americans require proper investment practices to succeed in our current market and have to do so while operating under unusually high financial stress, which typically leads to poor investment practices, so we have to be especially vigilant in how our circumstances may impair our investment decision making. The most important improvements to make are completing thorough research on whatever form of investment you choose, whether it be stocks, land, businesses, or something else, and focusing on long-term returns rather than short-term immediate results. We also see that it is crucial to keep loss aversion in check without completely disregarding it, since this is the main limiting factor when investing under financial stress.